Good evening. Good evening. Welcome to everyone who are joining us. I know people are joining us from all over the world, from Pakistan and other parts of South Asia. Hello to you. And from other parts of the world, including the US. We're very happy to have you. You are listening to Crisis and Consequences in Pakistan from the Lakshmi, Mittal and Family South Asia Institute. My name is Hitesh Hathi. I'm the incoming executive director of the Institute. I'm speaking to you from our offices here in Cambridge at Harvard University. I won't take up too much of your time. I just want to tell you a little bit about the Mithal Institute and welcome our panelists. It's very nice to have you here. Thank you for making time to join us. And we hope for our panelists and for also our listeners that we can welcome you with some nice chai and samosa at some point here in Cambridge. The Mithal Institute was founded in 2003. It's sort of on its third version now, with me joining. It was founded to be an interdisciplinary research institute to extend Harvard's work in South Asia, but really also to connect all of South Asia back to Harvard. So much intellectual, cultural, political, social energy happening there that would enrich work being done here. So it's meant as a two-way connection. We do all kinds of interdisciplinary research, major studies. We're doing a large one on healthcare in South Asia right now called the Lancet Citizens Commission. We've just completed a multi-year study on the partition. It's unusual because we are involving people in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, and the book on that will come out shortly. We host many panels, seminars, symposiums. We fund scholarship in both directions and host scholars and students both from the region here and fund others to be able to go there. So please check us out, join us for more events. I don't want to take up too much of your time. We're already a little bit late. I want to introduce I'll let actually our moderator, Yaqoob Bangash, introduce our panelists. Let me just introduce Yaqoob briefly and say just one or two words about our topic. Dr. Bangash is a visiting Fulbright scholar here at Harvard with the Mithal Institute this year. He is a historian of South Asia. Probably all of you know his first book, A Princely Affair, Accession and Integration of Princely States in Pakistan. It was published by Oxford University Press. He's working on a number of current projects. He's also been leading us here at the Mithal Institute into very fruitful and rich ways of thinking about our engagement with Pakistan, of intellectual and cultural work in Pakistan. So without much further ado, let me introduce Yaqoob and let him take it away. And I want to say, we're reaching you in the middle of one of those crisis moments, or perhaps at the end of one of those crisis moments that are so common all over South Asia. The amazing thing about us South Asians is we like to debate, and we debate our way through most things and find our way through most things. And we always find that there's some light to be shed in conversation. So that's what we're going to look for here. It's some weeks after the height of the crisis. So, what we're really doing today is looking at what this moment meant in the history and development of this ancient place and young nation, and what it portends for going forward. So Yaqoob Bangash, please take it forward. Thank you. I'll be going off camera, so the attention is on the speakers. Yaqoob.
Thank you so much, Hitesh, and especially for your kind words. And I'm very happy to be here at the Mithal Institute. And welcome to all the panelists. I'm quite sure for those of us joining from South Asia, all three panelists are very well known. So I'll just do a very quick introduction of them and then create some parameters for the conversation today. Our first panelist is Mr. Najma Sethi, who's a veteran journalist of the last, 40, 50 years for that matter. I think it's in his blood that he's been a journalist. He is the editor-in-chief of the Friday Times, has a very popular show on Channel 24 and of course online also. He has been the chairman of the Pakistan Cricket Board, and I should mention that under him, cricket came back to Pakistan, international cricket came back to Pakistan, which was his amazing achievement at a very difficult time. And he's also been the interim chief minister of Pakistan's largest province, the Punjab province, where he dealt again with a very tricky situation. So a very versatile person, and I think perhaps the best commentator on current politics in Pakistan. So we are very grateful, Najm, that you have agreed to join us today, and we really look forward to hearing from you today.
Thank you.
Next, we have Salman Akram Raja, who we are at least welcoming back to Oxford. Salman did his LLM here at the Harvard Law School. He is one of the leading lawyers of Pakistan at this time. He has led many constitutional cases and is a frequent commentator on all issues relating to law and society. So we are very grateful that Salman has taken time out and is speaking to us today about, again, giving a long view of what has happened and is going to happen in Pakistan. So Salman, thank you very much for joining us.
For sure.
And we also have a fellow academic, Professor Huma Baqai, who is a professor of international relations and a former associate dean of the business school at the Institute of Business Administration, Karachi. Professor Baqai, I always kind of wonder, because her official bio says over 25 years of experience, and I always wonder she was perhaps 5 when she began, because she looks incredibly young. But she's one of the foremost commentators on international relations in Pakistan, and we really look forward to hearing from her about Pakistan and its developing foreign policy and its foreign relations. So thank you so much, all three of you, for joining us today. I think talking about Pakistan, and especially having the long range view on Pakistan, we can't get a better panel than this. So let me just frame a couple of issues, and then I'll come towards you to each speak on your expert topic. So Pakistan, as we all know today, is currently going through perhaps its strangest crisis in some way. The usual tug of war in Pakistan has always been between the civilian politicians and the military. However, this time, two civilian forces, the Imran Khan-led Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, was versus practically most of the other political parties in the country. Here, of course, the military remains crucial and in a way still a deciding factor, but the nature of its involvement perhaps has changed in the current crisis. Then there is, of course, an assertive Supreme Court, which against certain expectations gave a very strong verdict towards constitutionalism. And for an American audience, I think an added interest is that the former Prime Minister Imran Khan claimed that his government was removed from power because of a US-led conspiracy, bringing in larger issues of global power, US hegemony, and regime change into the narrative. So I think we are at a very interesting juncture where a lot has happened in Pakistan. In the last month, we have had the first Prime Minister in Pakistan to be removed through a vote of no confidence. Before that, as of course the panelists know and many of our listeners know, that the last time it was tried was under Benazir Bhutto, and it didn't really work out. Well, the last real threat, of course, motions of no confidence have come in the past, but without really threatening a sitting government. But with that, we have had two full parliaments that have completed their term. And here I should mention that a lot of people in the West mistake the fact that in Pakistan, of course, no prime minister has done 5 years, but we have had two parliaments back to back doing 5 years, and we hope that this parliament would also do its 5 years. So parliaments have a term, prime ministers don't have a term, which I think a lot of Western commentators don't really get. So we have had a removal of a prime minister, but we have a parliament that's going towards completing its full term, which will be a first in Pakistan. We have had civil military relations where the military still remains very important and very central perhaps, but the role of the military perhaps has changed a bit, has shifted a bit, maybe not. That remains a key point. And the role of the Supreme Court, which has been developing over the last couple of decades, has also shifted and changed. So we are at a very interesting time, and to top it all, it's very much tied for the first time in a couple of generations, at least, to international affairs, to US calls of US involvement, to calls of more Islamic solidarity, Pakistan's positioning towards Russia, and all these other factors. So it's a very interesting mix that we have in front of us today. So we are very keen to hear from each of our panelists about their thoughts about where things are going. And I should say that from the outset that this conversation is not about Imran Khan versus the other, because that's a conversation that all three of you have spoken about so many times in Pakistan, and I'm probably sick and tired of it. So we want to move beyond that in teasing out the implications of what has happened for Pakistan as a country, looking at both the medium, short, and the long terms, what it bodes for the country, its society, its place in the world, and its developing politics. So with that preface, let me first turn to Najm Sethi Saab and request him to comment a bit on how the current scenario, what does that bode for Pakistan's democracy? Is Pakistan's democracy strengthened at the moment, weakened at the moment? What has happened to Pakistan's democracy after this crisis? And also an added thing, how do you see the rise of populism? That's become a big thing in Pakistan in recent weeks and years. How do you see that shaping up, especially within its wider international context? So over to you, Najm.
Thank you. I assume then, therefore, that we are not going to be discussing how this crisis came about and who played what particular role or the other. So we want to move beyond this in the sense that, yes, there is this crisis, and now we need to see what lies ahead. Is that right?
Yes, to an extent, but of course you can refer back and forth. But seeing, what are the lessons out of this? I think the focus.
Okay. Okay. Now the thing is that I think the first point I'd like to make is that this is not the end of the crisis. This is an ongoing crisis. We think that just because there's been a change of government and the military seems inclined not to intervene any further and let matters take their own course, my sense is this is not the end of the crisis. There is enormous pressure on the military, especially on the army chief, to intervene again. And this time in a way that brings Imran Khan back to power, or if not back to power, certainly back into contention. So having said that, and I say that for two reasons, and then we can look forward to see how this theme will work out. The situation is such right now that the government in Punjab and the government in Islamabad are both very fragile. The government in Punjab depends on its survival on a judgment of the Election Commission, which should be available within the month, which is likely to deseat a number of members of parliament who crossed the floor and voted for the PDM. And if that happens, the government will not be able to survive a vote of confidence. So my sense is that is very likely and very much on the cards sooner rather than later. Number one. Number two, Islamabad. Islamabad is also very fragile. It's dependent critically on one party, actually, the MQM. If the MQM were to at any stage pull out for whatever reason, the government in Islamabad would not be able to survive. It would not have the majority votes to continue to run parliament. So therefore, if both things happen at the same time, then you can't avoid a new election. And there is now mounting pressure from civil society supporters of Imran Khan to the military as an institution, barring the very top echelons of the military leadership. There is enormous support for this option to allow Imran Khan another chance to come back into power. He has a very strong middle class support base in the civil military bureaucracy, their families, and the urban middle classes. So the situation is very fragile, and my sense is that things are in a precipitous situation. What happens then is that if there are going to be fresh elections, then the whole issue of whether or not these can be held before the Election Commission of Pakistan is in a position to hold them after the delimitation and other issues that the Chief Election Commissioner has pointed to. He wants 7 months at the very least, but he's also said that he would like preferably to go into January of next year before he thinks he can complete his job. So we have a tricky situation. And where the election commissioner thinks that he needs 7 months at least. The governments are very fragile. The Punjab government is not going to be able to survive beyond the month. Maybe by some sort of tactics that Imran Khan and his supporters used to cling on to power and delay the eventual final ending. They may be able to drag it on a little bit because they may be able to get their own governor, and therefore the governor of Punjab might be able to protect them. But nonetheless, Punjab is very precarious. And if Punjab goes, then the likelihood is that you will want elections in Islamabad also. And therefore, another 3 months or 4 months of instability, the din of democracy on the streets, and no attention to the economy and international relations by any caretaker government will not be in a position to deal with these issues. All these issues require very hard decisions. I'm very apprehensive about political developments in this year, culminating, of course, in the big political development that everybody's got their eye on, which is the appointment of the next army chief in November. Whether a caretaker government does it, whether it's allowed to do it, whether it can legally do so or not, and or whether this government does it, or whether another government does it that comes in after the elections, and what the implications of that will be going forward. Right now, General Bajwa, the army chief, is under enormous pressure. He's being targeted, and very viciously targeted, by the PTI for having, quote unquote, conspired to bring about this situation. And every day that goes by, more and more questions are being asked about his particular role and that of one or two of his colleagues in this development.
Okay, great. Thank you for that, Najma. I think it's very interesting to see that there would still be a rocky road ahead, and I think the questions you have raised are very, very pertinent. So it seems perhaps that we might have an election sooner rather than later. But let me now bring in Salman and ask Salman: has anything changed in Pakistan through the last judgment of the Supreme Court? Is there a different direction that the Supreme Court will take now, or was this a blip? What do you see in the larger context of the development of the Supreme Court and its, to an extent, judicial activism in Pakistan? And with that, I also would like if you can address the questions of constitutionalism in Pakistan. Why is, one of the things which is very obvious in the last couple of weeks is there's very little respect for the constitution and its provisions in Pakistan. Why do you think that is there? Because, of course, as we all at least here know, that constitutions are the basic framing documents of a country. So why do you think, is there a lack of constitutional sort of, appreciation in Pakistan? And what does that mean, and where that leads us to? And with that, let me just sort of add a footnote. I hope a lot of our audience will see the chat option, so you can send your questions and I will ask them as we go through. But over to you, Salman.
Thank you, Yaqoob. Actually, the judgment I presume that you're referring to is the judgment that restored the assembly that the Prime Minister had purportedly dissolved, and directed that the vote of no confidence be carried out. At one level, to me as a lawyer, really this is not a remarkable judgment. What had happened on the 3rd of April with the presiding officer, the Deputy Speaker, not permitting a vote on the no confidence resolution, there really was no option but to say that what the Deputy Speaker had done was unconstitutional, illegal, beyond his authority, and to take matters back to where they were on the 3rd of April, which is that we had a Prime Minister facing a vote of no confidence. And once that vote of no confidence was carried out and the Prime Minister was removed, all else followed. So I don't see how this judgment was in any sense a jurisprudential breakthrough of any sort. It was the only judgment that the Supreme Court could have given. As soon as the Supreme Court restored the vote of no confidence resolution against the Prime Minister, the ability of the Prime Minister to have dissolved Parliament went away, and therefore the dissolution that the Prime Minister had caused was declared null and void. So everything kind of fitted in, followed, as a matter of really elementary constitutional governance. Now, is this judgment therefore a landmark of sorts? I would say no. It is a judgment that had to be given if the court had to retain any dignity at all. Had the court gone the other way and said that since the assembly has been dissolved, whether rightly or wrongly, we will let it remain dissolved and we will allow elections to go through, as was the demand being made on behalf of the PTI, the court really would have gone beyond the constitution and given a judgment that we often deride as a judgment based on some kind of doctrine of necessity. So the correct judgment was delivered. Now, what is interesting is that the correct judgment has resulted in this outrage on the part of the former Prime Minister and his supporters, who are considerable, as Najm just pointed out, a very large cohort within the Pakistani middle classes, within the army, within the civil services, are firm supporters of Imran Khan. And for them all to turn against the Supreme Court and to start deriding the Supreme Court for having delivered what to me is a fairly elementary, correct decision, says something about our attachment to constitutional processes. The next question that you raise, what is the status of the Constitution in our political and, I would say, societal order? Do we really believe that the Constitution constitutes our polity, that the Constitution really is something that our society should strive to uphold? Now, these are legitimate and valid questions. And the evidence that has come out is that really we look at constitutional processes and constitutional requirements as some kinds of means to what we perceive to be larger ends. So for the PTI supporter, the larger end was Mr. Khan staying in power. And therefore, constitutional processes should have been subservient to that larger end. And that says something about the educated middle classes and their relationship with the constitutional order. And if we go back historically, one has to say that this relationship has been a tenuous one. We do not really have a firm middle class consensus, illiterate urban middle class consensus around upholding the Constitution. Far too often we find that our, again, literate urban middle classes are okay with military interventions, are okay with martial laws, are okay to move on and, treat the Constitution as some kind of a dispensable luxury, which, if you can have, it's good. But if you can't have, you can, move on and do things otherwise. So the nature of our relationship with the Constitution, I think, is problematic. And why that is the case would take us into a deeper dive into, our history and the manner in which our constitutions have emerged through time. Now, if you look at the first constitution that we had in 1956, after the 1954 dissolution of the then Constituent Assembly that was engaged in the framing of a constitution, and then that assembly goes away and suddenly we have another Constituent Assembly handpicked, in fact, by the establishment, and you end up with a new constitution. Now, where was the buy-in into that constitution? Was this a constitution that reflected the culmination of some kind of a historic process that had the people involved engaged in it? The answer has to be no. The next constitution of 1962 is an even more ridiculous document, created by the military dictator, General Yaqoob Khan, and it says that I, General Yaqoob Khan, hereby give to the people of Pakistan a constitution. Now, that is not how constitutions that have, the people supporting them or the people standing up for come into existence. Now, the 73 Constitution is a more interesting document, which is our current Constitution, despite its various, iterations and reiterations and amendments through time. If you look at the 73 Constitution, that again is not how constitutions generally come about in the world or have come about in history. Normally, constitution making follows some kind of a successful people's revolution. So if you look at the US Constitution, the Constitution follows the, the independence of the revolution against the king. Similarly, you look around, France, or you look across the globe, you find that constitutions that have sunk deep roots are really the outcome of a successful campaign or a successful revolution against what was seen to be an oppressive order. Now, the 73 constitution comes about because the then military dictator, Yahya Khan, wanted us to have a constitution. So one day he announced that here is the LFO, the Legal Framework Order, and under this legal framework order, there will be an election, and the assembly that will be elected will be called the Constituent Assembly, and that assembly will then frame a constitution. Now, this is not really the people, giving to themselves a constituent assembly. It is a dictator dictating that there will be a constituent assembly. Now, once that assembly comes into existence, it does good work. It is a representative assembly. The 70 elections are generally taken to be better than most other elections that we've had in history. But this process is then led by Mr. Bhutto, the prime minister after the division of the country, East Pakistan and Bangladesh. What is left of the assembly that was elected in 1970, the Rump Assembly, gives a constitution. And the whole process is led by Mr. Bhutto. But then we see that Mr. Bhutto today is a political figure of high standing, but you have a huge constituency, and in particular, a constituency manned by ex-servicemen. You've got all these ex-servicemen forum that tell us day in, day out that Mr. Bhutto, in fact, is responsible for the breakup of Pakistan, and he was, in fact, some kind of a maniac who destroyed Jinnah's Pakistan. So he has been cast in the imagination of a fair number of Pakistanis, not as the founding father of the constitutional order, but as some kind of a villain responsible for the breakup of the country. And that, I would argue, along with all the others who were engaged in the constitution-making process, the National Awami Party, led by Wali Khan, Bazenjo, all of these people, in fact, Mr. Bhutto himself, acted to have declared traitors, and their party declared, a party acting against the integrity of Pakistan as quickly as 1974, hardly a few months after the adoption of the 1973 Constitution. So we find that everybody involved in the constitution-making process of the 1973 Constitution has been maligned at some level in the popular imagination. So when we look back at the Constitution and the framers of that Constitution, we do not look back to our Madison or Hamilton, the founding fathers. We don't have the equivalent of the Federalist Papers. What we look back and what we're made to look back to is a set of controversial politicians who have been attacked by one cohort or the other within our polity, and often by the military governments that we've had, the Zia government and the Musharraf government. They've looked back and described these people, civilian politicians, in not glowing terms. So you've created an atmosphere in Pakistan and an intellectual discourse and an intellectual atmosphere that has never really venerated the constitution that emerged in 1973 as the outcome of some kind of a democratic revolution. And in fact, it wasn't. In fact, the constitution followed our greatest loss, the division of the country, the War of 1971. It was a constitution given by a rump assembly of politicians who were then to be maligned, even executed. And the whole thing, therefore, in our memory, in our collective memory, is not a moment of triumph. And that is why today the Pakistani middle class is very, casual in denigrating that entire process and the value of the constitution itself. It's really not seen as an organic reflection or expression of the deepest values of the people, as it were. You've got all these contending, discourses, the Islamist discourse, which tells you that political parties, in fact, are not something acceptable to an Islamic polity. Zia, ran with that for 10 years. And the remnants of that discourse remain among us, that the parliamentary system somehow is not consistent with the, caliphate, that is the Islamic ideal. The presidential system with the president as some kind of a caliph is in fact what we should have. So we've got all these conversations, these conversations at cross purposes going on in our intellectual and popular discourse all the time. And that, I would argue, has created a psychological, if you like, distance between the Pakistani urban literate middle classes and the constitutional framework that we as lawyers and as judges and as political activists, want to uphold and see venerated. But it does not carry the kind of veneration that you and I would like to see it have.
Thank you very much for that, Salman. And I think that's a very critical and an important point, that the process of constitution making and the way our last constitution even came about, and the way it's been thought of and treated has raised so many questions that veneration no longer exists. And I always remember when I teach my class on the history of Pakistan that in 1970, the parliament that was elected was that parliament. In that parliament, the majority was with the Awami League, and Mujibur Rahman should have become the prime minister, not Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. So the first, if you want to use the title, first elected prime minister of Pakistan was Mujibur Rahman, who wasn't allowed to become the prime minister. And it was that undermining of the democratic principle that actually led to the split of the country. So I think, and then of course, Bhutto became the first civilian chief martial law administrator and, president, and then again, became himself the prime minister of that rump assembly also. So there are all these factors that kind of added into it, but I think that's a very important conversation to have. But let me bring in Dr. Huma Baqai now and take kind of the much larger picture. Dr. Baqai, one of the things that I, would really want your kind of view on is that this is perhaps one, at least in living memory in the last couple of generations, at least, this is the first time that a change of government has happened where the outgoing government has said that it is squarely the responsibility of a foreign government, the US government in this case, for their removal. Now, of course, the US government over the last couple of, since the inception of Pakistan for that matter, has had a role in Pakistan, and of course they have affected the way governance is actually done in the country. But this kind of a very targeted manner hasn't really happened before. So what does this say about what has been alleged? But in the broader picture, what does that say about the larger foreign relations of the country? So let's assume there are elections and Imran Khan comes back to power. He has now taken a very clear anti-US stance. What does that bode for Pakistan's foreign relations? And how do you see Pakistan going ahead in its foreign relations with that kind of a very critical and now a very fundamental anti-American stance? Do you think that we will go more towards Russia and towards other blocks now after having finally written off? Because of course a lot of back and forth has gone between what we think of the US and everywhere. So what does this bode, what has happened in the last month, how does this bode in the larger framework of Pakistan and its foreign relations with the US, but also the rest of the world for that matter?
Thank you, Dr. Bangash. You see, it's interesting how Pakistan-US relations have progressed over the years. So if you look at our relationship, we've been the most allied ally, the most sanctioned ally, the most bombed ally, and perhaps also a non-NATO ally. So those are the kind of alliances that we've had with the United States. Have we had difficult moments in this relationship? If I use the cliche term, absolutely yes. And moments that have been far more difficult than this, and where Pakistan has protected its core interest despite the fact that it's a small country and has a lot of pressures, including a shrinking economic sovereign space. So we chose to become a nuclear power despite all the pressures that happened. And then we also became the most sanctioned ally. After that, we continued to have a policy towards the Taliban, which irked the United States, but eventually resulted in what Pakistan was aiming for and has been able to achieve that. We've had Salala. We found Osama bin Laden in Abbottabad. And the relationship has continued. And I think the same will happen after this thing settles down. What is happening is that this thing is not going away in the domestic politics of Pakistan. It has not gone away with the no confidence move that had happened. It has not gone away with the 2 commissions that were put into place. And today, Maryam Gauratse, which is the information minister of the new government, has announced about perhaps a 3rd commission, which they say will have nobody will have someone to chair it, nobody will be able to contest. Now, that's a very tall order in the polity of Pakistan. What has happened is that the polarization that exists in the polity of Pakistan has never happened before. And Imran Khan is a very unconventional leader, and he's done everything unconventional from the day one, including how he's treated his relationship with the United States. What has happened is that his narrative of independent foreign policy, so to say, that Pakistan has always had protecting its core interest, is that it has dovetailed with him sort of emerging as somebody who speaks about Islamophobia, who held the OIC summit. So it's dovetailed with his being the face or the leadership of the Muslim world, so to say, which resonates very well with the people. Moreover, you see, I think the dilemma Pakistan faces today is that our choices are really not very pretty. Our choices are between the corrupt and the inefficient, if I may say so. And the fact that this coalition that has come together of 13 parties has not been able to destigmatize itself from the corruption thing. And, you know, he constantly now brings in and compares himself to Qaeda-Azam, but then he also compares himself to Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. And the first generation of all of these people, all of this leadership had come together to bring down Zulfikar Ali Bhutto as well. And I also personally think that now he is targeting PMLN far more aggressively than he's targeting Pakistan People's Party, which I think will eventually determine the subsequent plan, the political matrix of Pakistan subsequently. He will continue to be unconventional. He will continue to generate pressure on the sitting government. And the sitting government is in a very, very difficult place, if I may say so. These are 13 parties who have come together, and they will just keep on accommodating each other and not being able to deliver. So Mifta Ismail is a very smart man who understands what needs to be done with the economy, but he dare not increase the energy prices. And that is what Imran Khan has left them with. On top of that, he will continue the pressure of rallies. Is he popular among the masses? You have no idea. I witnessed 2 of his rallies in Karachi, and I've lived in Karachi, and I've seen all the rallies that have been there for MQM, nothing compared what we saw. And the first one that happened right after his removal was not even mobilized. They had not even asked for it. People had come together themselves, and the numbers were huge. They chose to do the national anthem, which has now become a norm in all the subsequent rallies that Imran Khan is doing. So, you know, he's emerging as not somebody who's a political party, but somebody who represents Pakistan. You know, that's how he's portraying himself. And interestingly, that is being accepted, and it's resonating with the people. I work with students all the time. So I have a class of 150 students. Since this thing has happened, they are just very, very angry. And we talked about constitutionalism, and we talked about the institutions of Pakistan just now. You know, in these young people, and I speak to them all the time, they think that the parliament is manipulated, the judiciary is compromised, and the establishment is not fair. So what Imran Khan has done now is that he does not target the military negatively, because he still wants their help to come in to put him where he wants to see himself. And with the United States also, he constantly says that I'm not against the United States. I'm not against any country. I'm against their policy. And in the last 2 speeches, he said, what we should be worrying for is that an officer whose level is really low can give such a statement about. So, you know, he's building this narrative about Pakistan being an independent state, a self-respecting state. And on the flip side, I think the people they say the right things, but they're not articulate enough. And the cases that they're trying to bring against Imran Khan are just not what people are ready to swallow. So they think because they cannot find something or anything against him, they've brought in the Tosha Khana, which are the gifts that he got, or they've brought in this Farah Gogi case. Things were not perfect in Punjab. I tend to agree. But, you know, people refuse to take or swallow the fact that Imran Khan is perhaps as corrupt as the people he said are as corrupt, or they actually believe that he's being punished for standing up to this corrupt mafia. That is how people see him. And I think it's going to be difficult to move forward from it. I totally agree with Mr. Najm Sethi that November is a very crucial, critical time. It's the elephant in the room. I think eventually the decision will happen there. But what scares me, or a lot of other political scientists in Pakistan, is that we've talked about the continuity of democracy in Pakistan despite these hiccups and these road bumps. But a situation may emerge that the intervention would become necessary, or the intervention would have the cover of the constitution, where an emergency is called in, and they would have to come in not because they choose to, but because they would be left without an option. So my submission here is that the polarization that there is and the difficult position that this government is also in, I think they should move on with the elections. And if they're delaying elections, they should perhaps say that there are technical reasons for doing it, be it constitution, the limitations, be it the census. We also have a problem there. And as soon as those are addressed, we will move into the elections, because Imran Khan is in that mode. I think he'll come in more aggressively after Eid. He's already announced one thing in Miyawali. He constantly threatens of a huge thing in Islamabad. Will he be able to mobilize people from what we've seen in the last 5 rallies that he's done? Apparently, yes.
Great. Thank you very, very much for that, Dr. Baqai. And I really like how you began by articulating that, it's the conversation between the corrupt versus the inefficient. I think that's a very good framing of it. But let me, there are a number of questions coming up, but let me just ask the panelists a couple of questions that I've gleaned from that, and then we'll ask some other questions also from the audience. Well, two things, Dr. Baqai, if you can comment on. Since you've worked on foreign policy for decades now, how much do you think, aside from its political mileage, in terms of foreign relations and in terms of sort of, what you actually think from your experience happened, how far do you personally think was there truth in that whole, conversation between Donald Lu and the Pakistani ambassador? How serious do you think that is in a diplomatic framework, rather than what the political side of that is? And secondly, that I wanted to ask you was the fact that this whole conversation of independent foreign policy, to some extent, you also mentioned Pakistan has always had its core interests at its helm, because, the military has always been very much involved in foreign policy, and it doesn't, I think, deviate too much from it. What's the real yearning in Pakistan that this resonates? You spoke about the young people and everything. What is the real yearning? Do they want Pakistan to emerge as some dramatic world power, and that's not happening, and that is what they see in Imran Khan, that with him we'll just emerge as a leading world power? What's that missing sort of tick that Imran Khan kind of provides? So if you could comment on it.
I think the missing tick is the fact that he just comes across and says things people have been thinking about. I think his speeches in the United Nations have not just resonated with people in Pakistan, they've resonated with the Muslim world. His take on Islamophobia is extremely popular across the board. And also with this particular incident, that, of course, Imran Khan, I have no doubt about the fact that he's conveniently used it to sort of take forward his own narrative. But once again, it has resonated with the people. I think we've had more humiliating and tough conversations with the United States. I, for one, constantly say that one of the problems that we have with the United States is that they actually use public humiliation as a tool of foreign policy when it comes to Pakistan, and which makes it very difficult for Pakistani leadership to comply. And that has been the case since Musharraf, who was perhaps one of the most aligned the Pakistani leadership with the United States. So I think that has remained a case, and now there's resentment against it. And also the fact that we've been pitching to our people that we will Now we have options. I mean, Pakistan's foreign policy was always about constraints and compulsions. And all of a sudden, for the last 6-7 years, we're saying it's about options and choices. And those options and choices are rooted in our relationship largely with China, but also with Russia now. Imran Khan has used it once again, where he says that I went to Russia with everybody's consent, but essentially I went to Russia because I could bring you cheaper energy. And we could have actually brought down the inflation in the country, and I was not allowed to do that. So yes, all of that just resonates with the people in a way where they actually line up behind it. Bangash, I have heard people, and these are not young, these are people who say that, when we look at him and when we hear him talk, and when this no confidence move happened, it was like a repeat of 71. That's how we felt. So I personally think that, and I also think that both the establishment and these 14 parties had no idea that he would be able to generate this kind of support, because they had started off this march against him, or this movement against him, on the pitch of food inflation largely. Now, what has happened is that in 3 weeks, he is out there saying all those things that he does not have to do a thing about, and these people have the control. They are in power, and they are being.
Sorry.
They're being. Hello?
Yeah, continue.
And they're being asked to bring the prices down, which they are unable to do. We just got over Ramzan. You understand, this is the month people fast, and the food inflation just ran away. And I think those are issues that this particular government will not be able to resolve, no matter how I try. So, in my opinion, it will also sit well for them to call for elections. And I think if you want to prevent anarchy, so to say, which is a real option now. Seems like a real option. The way forward are elections. But the question is that, can we hold elections, free and fair elections? The results would be accepted after that or not. Where I think that this situation may just swirl out of control. That's how I see it.
And a quick comment on the Don Lu versus the ambassador thing. Do you think that was a serious thing, or that's more a political thing now rather than a diplomatic thing?
I think it could have been ignored or handled far more quietly than it was.
Okay, great. Let me bring in Najm now. And as you have said that instability, of course, is going to increase perhaps over the next couple of months. Do you think there are any chances that it might, as towards the end of it, Dr. Baqai kind of mentioned, that it might even lead towards anarchy? Do you think it can ever spiral out of hand? That's one question. The second one that I wanted to ask is, with whatever has happened in Pakistan, and we always like to compare ourselves to India, but in India, votes of no confidence are not a big deal. Weak coalitions are not a big deal. All these things happen all the time, and yet the democracy trods on. Do you think what's happened in the last month or so has been a good experience for Pakistan's democracy? What will it do to democracy in Pakistan? Would it strengthen it, or would it strengthen those people who are against democracy and want a different kind of a system, as Salman mentioned, brought in? What do you think will the current crisis and how it manifests itself in the next couple of months do to the idea of democracy in Pakistan? Enes, you're muted. You need to unmute yourself, Enes.
Okay, I think it's unmute. Okay. Thank you. I'd like to just make some comments on what the other participants have said and then move on from there. I agree with Salman that the Constitution doesn't have the sort of societal consensus that popular constitutions given by popular founding fathers should have. But at the end of the day, it still survived, even though it's in a mangled form. And instances where the judiciary and civil society have stuck together to keep it moving, keep it going, are as many as those now where it has broken down, either because of pressure from the military or because of pressure on the judges from their own kith and kin, or civil society. So therefore, that point is well taken. But I think we need to now say what does that mean for this particular middle class that we are now talking about. Now, demographically speaking, this middle class is not yet in a position to dictate what sort of constitution we should have, or indeed to win an election without any intervention from the military. All the popular polls right now show that in a free and fair election, Imran would still not get a majority, much as he didn't get a majority in the last election, but was made to get a majority. I mean, those are facts. I mean, not talking about perceptions. Those are facts. Now, the thing is that Huma has just talked about why she thinks that the election is the panacea. An immediate election is the panacea for further development. My sense is, in fact, quite the opposite. And let me make my case. The situation is such that Imran has refused to accept the contours of the constitution. He is using street power and a very powerful propaganda outfit to create a narrative that is very, very popular amongst the middle classes and is resounding. But will that narrative be sufficient in an election to get him a majority? No, I don't think so. And we can go into the details of that at some stage, but I don't think so. Which is to say that in the event that there was to be an election, and in a free and fair election, which again is a bit of a problem, but still, suppose he doesn't win a majority. What is to stop him from using the same tactics that he's using now to get an election? What is to stop him from rejecting the results of that election and going back on the warpath? That is the sort of situation that will create the sort of crisis that Dr. Huma is talking about, where you will have a terrible situation where the military might have to intervene to restore law and order, or to, shall we say, stop the circle from completing itself again and again. So that is a recipe, in my view, for chaos and anarchy, given the fact that Imran is using a particular method to climb back into power, and anything short of that that goes against it will not be acceptable to him. It's not acceptable to him. His manner of removal is not acceptable to him. His current situation is not acceptable to him. He's now putting pressure on the military to intervene on his side by stopping its so-called neutrality and nudging the whole process into a new election. As I said, I mean, constitutionally, as long as the alliance sticks together, and they have every reason to stick together unless they're told not to stick together, or some of them, Islamabad can survive. Punjab can have fresh elections. There can be by-elections on the seats that have been vacated or de-seated. And we should know what the results of those will be. But to say that we should have an election just because Imran Khan now wants an election, and to think that that election is going to solve anything, no. I think what we really need to look at right now is that we are facing two types of crises that are going to be, shall we say, those crises are likely to be deepened if there were to be an immediate call for elections. Number one, the polarization in society would be also deepened, but still there is a process going on. We might be able to work our way through it. But at the end of the day, the economic crisis that we face today, which is largely the creation of the earlier government, 4 years of inefficiency, as somebody put it, have led us to this situation. And critically, the resolution of that, certainly in the short term, depends entirely on the very countries and blocks that Imran is attacking. In terms of debt repayments, and in terms of loans, and in terms of grants, and so on. Even the Saudi loans are linked to compliance with IMF conditions and so on. And so therefore, my sense is that that is likely to be disrupted in the event of an election going forward, which is to say another 6 months of instability are going to really turn the screws on the Pakistan economy. And whether or not the establishment can afford to confront a situation that emerges afterwards, which could again be destabilizing if Imran refuses to accept that situation. Then we will really be in the middle of a huge bankruptcy staring us in the face. And the one force that is going to be most affected by something like that are, of course, the armed forces, which take a huge chunk of the budget and are used to a particular lifestyle. So I think there is that particular crisis. Then there's the other issue: relations with the West, relations with our trading partners, as Huma put it, traditional partners. You can't stop trading, and you can't start lashing out at them in such a way that you have no recourse to the facilities that trade and aid offer you in the short term. And there is no alternative. It's not as though the Chinese and the Saudis are going to be able to give you the sort of money to get you out of your debt trap. That's just not possible. It's not there. So my sense is that this whole episode, unless it's resolved in the only way possible, which is a constitutional way, because at the end of the day, that's what stops us from going into anarchy. That's the only way out. And so therefore, my sense is that Imran's current strategy is one that he's honed to perfection. His propaganda, agitation, propaganda narrative is very powerful. It can destabilize, but whether it can win back power without any intervention from the military is absolutely, in my view, out of the question. He is currently asking the military to step in and restore him to power. Suppose the military does nothing. Despite the pressure on the military from its own rank and file that Imran has cultivated and which buys into his narrative, which is very much a reality. Suppose the leadership thinks that, no, this is not that moment at which we capitulate to these emotions and these sentiments. We need to look beyond this crisis, beyond indeed the crisis that will come in November. If the military thinks in that fashion, then I think we can get through this crisis. And Imran will have to learn to live within the constitutional limits of power and popularity and so on and so forth, and power sharing. But the attack on General Bajwa is calibrated. And it is moving from one point to another point with alarming speed and accuracy. It is now accusing, in the latest episode, starting from the fact that that letter, everybody read it properly, and therefore now the military is turning around and saying that, no, we didn't read it the way you read it, and so on. Now it's different. In the last 3 or 4 days, it's directly, the attack is coming on General Bajwa. The PTI and its supporters are saying that General Bajwa conspired to bring the opposition into power, number one. In other words, he was not neutral. He was actually anti-Imran, and he brought in the opposition. Without him, they wouldn't be where they are today. And secondly, that General Bajwa and the military hierarchy, or the military high command, knew about this letter. This is the latest. That this letter, they knew about the contents of this letter at least 4 or 5 days before the government and Shah Mahmood Qureshi, the foreign minister, learnt of it. Because the letter, the cable was sent to a number of people, including the military establishment, which is the norm in cables such as this. And he's now saying that the military actively, or General Bajwa actively conspired to put a lid on the letter. And so therefore, the attack is now moving into high gear. And General Bajwa is under enormous pressure to step up and to try and protect himself. And the attempt is to isolate him from the rank and file and those forces that are building up pressure, so that he steps back. And when he steps back, what they want him to do right now is to give a wink and a nod, either to the MQM, in which case the federal government will fall, and some of the other allies, and which is not difficult at all. So the military stance that it stepped back from being pro-Imran to being into a neutral position is now being challenged. In fact, the opposite is being alleged. One last point. The interesting thing in all this is that if the military had actually wanted not to be neutral, in the sense of, okay, we're hands off, you guys do whatever you want to do. The easiest thing in the world, in other words, if they had been pro the revival of the old order, the easiest thing in the world would have been to just enforce a vote of confidence, not a vote of no confidence. Stitching together a vote of no confidence has taken 5 months since November. It has led to all manner of issues. It has been an incredibly difficult task with the ups and downs and not knowing which way, which general is making phone calls and so on. Whereas the easiest thing in the world would have been to ask one or two of Imran Khan's allies to pull out, and then to ask Imran to take a vote of confidence. But they didn't do that. That would have been a direct military intervention, because these allies, the MQM and the Chaudhrys, etc., would have done exactly what the military would have wanted. So my sense is there's been a lot of confusion. And I think when the facts are slowly emerging, we will find that Imran has been his own worst enemy. And the issue, as has been framed, of corruption versus incompetence or inefficiency, yes, that is absolutely true. That is the way the middle classes see it. That's not the way the rest of the country sees it. The rest of the country either doesn't much care about corruption, it's always lived with corruption. The electables are not elected because they are pro or anti-corruption and so on. There is still that other Pakistan that exists out there, which is not the urban middle class Islamic nationalist Pakistan, which is traditional Pakistan, where voting is based on traditional patterns and local issues. There's that issue. And so finally, my sense is that the best way out of the situation is for the military to stay neutral now, not to give a wink and a nod here and there and to create a new crisis. This government is quite capable, as was Imran Khan's government, as was Nawaz Sharif's government in the past, to tackle any manner of popular dharnas and strikes and so on. Imran Khan's dharna was backed by the military, and yet they couldn't overthrow Nawaz Sharif. So therefore, I think Imran knows that. This dharna, million march, all the rest of it is not going to go anywhere. It's not going to, unless there is an intervention by the military, which is what the attempt is, to provoke a military intervention and to therefore wrap up the whole thing. So I have a different take on how things are moving forward. But at the end of the day, I think we're in a stage of great instability and economic crisis. And I think if this government is able to plow through the next 6 or 7 months, I think we will then get into a situation where reality and sense will prevail. And when the next elections roll around, certain yardsticks and certain rules of law will have been established. And therefore, we will be in a better position to confront the divide in society as such. There's only one document, or however tattered it may be, that can keep this country together. And that is the same one that was crafted in 1973 by a consensus of all the regional and nationalist and Islamic parties. And that's the only one that still has a semblance of consensus behind it. And for this middle class now to ask that it be torn again, and this time in its favor, is not really doing Pakistan any good service.
Thank you very, very much for that very astute analysis. And I think, you made a very important point that, it might have been easier to do a vote of confidence rather than a vote of no confidence. And I think that's a very important distinction that one must remember. But from your last point about the constitution, let me now bring in Salman. Salman, from your last comments, I began to think, and a couple of questions have alluded to that. Do you think there is a time, well, I'll ask you two things. First is, do you think there is a time for a new framework to be created in Pakistan, a new constitutional document, a new agreement to be formed in Pakistan? And if so, how do you think that can be formulated? And the second thing that I wanted you to comment on was in the larger framework that, of course, populism has come in big form around the world, in the US, in Brazil, next door in India. And a lot of that is dependent on not removing the constitution, but kind of undermining it in clever patterns. How far do you think this kind of maneuvering of the constitution will happen and will continue to happen in Pakistan if the current scenario continues?
Let me start with the second question. The maneuvering of the constitution is exactly what the PTI government led by Mr. Khan wanted. So the refusal to allow a vote on the no confidence resolution by the deputy speaker, and then later on, after the Supreme Court judgment, the filibustering that we saw, that real intent not to act on the Supreme Court judgment, and still not carry out, actual voting. So what was happening was a manipulation of the constitutional husk, if you like. So the idea was that we will play around and we will undermine the constitution in its essence, but remain formally, as it were, attached to the constitution. But in fact, what we saw was not even formal attachment. So what the deputy speaker did in refusing a vote, or what the PTI parliamentarians were doing by not permitting a vote even after the Supreme Court had directed that a vote be carried out, shows that the constitution was being seen as, an inconvenience that had to be somehow dealt with and maneuvered around. So that is very much there, that use of the constitution as some kind of a tool to be used when convenient, and to be manipulated and hollowed out when it's not convenient to the political party. And it's not just the PTI. I would expect other political parties to behave in similar ways. But what one hopes is that over time maturity grows across the political spectrum and people start actually believing in this constitution. We forget now how it came about, what happened in 1970 or 73. The fact is, this is the only framework we have for ordering our collective existence. And this is the framework that we need to work with. And can we change this framework? Is this the moment for some kind of a new constitutional order? I don't see this as such a moment. I don't see us at some kind of a revolutionary juncture in our collective existence, in our history, where various forces can come together and agree upon a new constitutional framework. So we are really nowhere close to that. And even in a formal sense, it's not possible. In fact, after the acceptance of the basic structure doctrine by our Supreme Court, to even amend the constitution beyond, certain parameters. So the idea is that the basic structure, which is the parliamentary form of government, the Islamic provisions, the role of the judiciary, none of these things can really be amended in any significant radical sort of way. So I don't see any radical reordering of the constitutional framework happening at any point soon. And even in the medium term, I don't see that kind of a consensus emerging in society to allow that kind of reframing to happen. So we really need to work with the constitution we have, and that is where the role of the Supreme Court becomes important. The role of the quote unquote intelligentsia becomes important. That we step aside, step away from our political allegiances, whatever they might be, and demand that the constitution be taken seriously. That the constitution has a prescribed text. That this text is not endlessly fuzzy or malleable. There are certain things that have to be done in a certain manner, in a certain time frame, and those things should be done. So the consensus that we need to, I think, aspire for among the urban, literate middle classes is, acceptance of the constitution as a governing framework, and not something to be discarded in order to achieve a political end. So that for me is the real quest that we should engage in, and conversations like the one that we're having now, I believe, play a part in raising the issue and in inviting people to engage with the constitution seriously.
Thank you, Salman. And I think, of course, which I hope is very clear to the audience, that a lot of the questions that we have raised today are substantial topics, deserving their own panels. But this was just an idea to kickstart the conversation, to look beyond what has just happened, to look at the larger and long-lasting implications of the current scenario on Pakistan. But let me move to some particular questions that have been coming in. And there are two very specific that Dr. Baqai can perhaps come in. One person has asked, Dr. Baqai, about the role of China. Of course, other countries have been mentioned, but China is one exception in the current scenario. There is really nothing that we have heard from China, on China. So what do you think is going to happen there? And the second question that has come in for you, which is that if Imran Khan comes back to power, do you think that he will substantially change Pakistan's foreign policy, or do you think that there will be a rapprochement with the US once he comes back to power?
Well, absolutely, yes. There'll be a rapprochement with the United States, goes without saying. The same is true for Europe also. Imran Khan is using this largely to prop himself domestically, not anywhere else. And he has already started saying that it's not about the US. It's just their policy. So I think that is not going to change. What was your other question, Dr. Bangash?
The other question was about China.
Well, China is China. China is always quite diplomacy behind the doors. But the private conversations that I have had, and which is also the larger perception, that China was also not very happy with the performance of this government, the last government, so to say. And they have actually put that forward. And I've spoken to people who categorically said that as long as the relationship was government to government, it worked. But when it came to business, that means private initiatives from China doing more from Pakistan, nothing was happening on that front. Now, even if you look at the statements given by Mifta and people who belong to this particular government, I think the tone is the same. China remains a very important part of Pakistan's foreign policy. Like I said earlier, they give us options and choices. They give us support when none others do. Well, can we entirely depend on China for our economic bailouts? No, we cannot. And thus this whole debate about IMF, Imran Khan wasted 1.5 years trying not to go to IMF, which was very, very crucial time lost. This particular government went immediately to the IMF, but have not been able to say yes to what IMF is asking them to do. The bailout that was committed from Saudi Arabia also did not happen. There has been no documents have signed, although Mr. Ismail had chosen to stay back. So our engagement with the West is crucial and critical. China is not a substitute for US and Europe. Everybody across the board understands that. This is largely for local consumption. I think even the US understands that. That's how I see.
I think it's very interesting that there's a very consensus view in the foreign policy sort of circles in Pakistan, but on the public perception, on the domesticization of these international relations, that's been where the gap has been. But let me bring Najma now, because NS has, as I'm sure you can all imagine, has the most questions directed towards him. Some he has answered in his comments, but let me sort of add a couple of them and ask him. The first question is about the internal situation in the military. So one person asks that is that a very critical split between Bajwa on one side and General Faiz on the other side, and are there other players in the military who are going to create an issue there? And attached to that question is the question of what is the current crisis going to do to the credibility of the military in the eyes of the public? Has that been affected pretty badly? How are they going to recover that?
Let me answer the second question first, because it's a simple answer. The credibility of the military has been undermined and eroded in the last 4 years. So that's, and this was a culmination of everything they did which went wrong. So that's an established fact now, and they're having to grapple with the outcome of their yet another experiment in trying to remain behind the scenes but govern this country, because they can't now directly enter the scene. So therefore, I think the military's credibility is low. Having said that, the first question is very important in terms of what is the division, if there is any. I think I said very clearly that the rank and file, a majority of the rank and file, have the same sentiments and perceptions as their compatriots in the civilian middle classes. And the love for democracy is not just exactly established in either the middle classes, urban middle classes, as Salman pointed out, nor indeed in the military, whose entire training has been anti-democracy. From day one, they're told that politicians are crooks and rascals and we can't trust them and so on and so forth. And this whole notion of this narrative of corruption has largely been at the behest of the military. And they keep changing their horses, as it were. And then when they try and run their horses, the horses tend to sort of revolt or don't actually obey all their commands. And then they get impatient and then they start new experiments. But and I think this is now, frankly, the culmination of this whole process of experimentation, bringing somebody in, getting rid of them, bringing somebody in, getting rid of them, whether it was someone like Junaid, whether it was Nawaz and then Benazir and so on. At every stage, their pawn has revolted and wanted to become a knight or a king. And that's the inherent nature of the beast of politics and constitution. The constitution has survived the onslaughts of the military. And that has given hope to the emerging Democrats who were born in the nursery of the military. And Imran is no different. The only difference is that, historically speaking, urban middle classes, when they're formed, don't have a party. Parties belong to the nobility or the landed elites of pre-capitalist times or pre-independence times. And the newly emerging middle classes have to find a party and to articulate their interests. And that's not always the easiest thing because of the demographic factor and economic development and urbanization and so on. And in Pakistan's case, that has taken an immeasurably longer time than it should have if there hadn't been so much political instability. And if growth had been 6 or 7% for at least 30 years, we might have been there today. The urban middle classes might have dictated what they would have done or not. But historically, the urban middle classes have gone in 3 directions. And if you look at world history, and we are no different. In India, as Salman pointed out, and the implications of what he pointed out, Nehru did create a constitution, and there was a consensus on it. And it is too large a country and disparate a country that Nehru talked about. Unity in the division of the country, in the disunity, in the flowering of different states and emotions. So the constitution held it together, and they went on the democratic path. And India was, so the Indian middle classes chose, and the Indian middle classes played a very important role in the freedom movement. So therefore, there was a vested interest in moving along that path. And they have survived the vicissitudes of authoritarian rule by Mrs. Gandhi and others, and even now, the majoritarian rule by Narendra Modi and so on. But if you look at Pakistan, the choice for our middle class, for all these reasons that were not present in Pakistan, the landed classes, despite the fact that Jinnah was a sole spokesman, it was the landed classes and others, and right at the end, it was a stroke of circumstance and firm leadership that brought Pakistan into being. But the civil military bureaucracy was always more developed and always more politically conscious and aggressive than the nascent middle classes. And the landlords historically have been with the authoritarian powers, whether it was colonial rule or others. And so they went along with the military. And therefore, our path has been different. Now the situation is, the middle class, where does it go? The landed classes like this form of democracy where they have parliament in their control, and they can't allow parliament to pass laws to bring about land reforms or to bring about other dynamic changes. So we have a problem there. But they still dominate, shall we say, the vote bank. And the middle classes obviously want a party of their own. They thought they had a party of their own in Zulfikar Ali Bhutto's People's Party, but that was not the case. It turned out that the Bhutto was also dependent on the same classes in the final analysis. And similarly, Imran Khan, when I asked Imran about why he was getting electables in when he needed ideologues, his answer was that, where are we going to find the angels? And I need to get into power. And now he's found out what happens when you rely on forces such as this, which are rooted in Pakistani society, these electables and so on. So the middle class, where would it have gone? It can't be part of the existing order because it wants to change that. It doesn't have the demographic strength to do that. It has always supported, as Salman pointed out, it has always supported authoritarian rule because it's least affected by the trappings of democracy, either by votes or the freedom of speech and other things that are enshrined in the constitution, which means so much to some of us. This middle class, you ask a middle class guy who's a strong Imran Khan supporter, who is the MP that you voted for? They won't even know their name because they're not interacting. It's not constituency politics for them. So therefore, the authoritarian figure, the cult figure, the presidential figure makes sense to them. But constituency politics and representative politics doesn't make sense to them. So this middle class historically became the bourgeoisie in certain countries. In other countries, it went into the other camp, the socialist camp or the communist camp. And then in some countries, it went into the fascist camp. So those are the only three broad routes and then variations on the theme that can happen. And in our case, our middle class has clearly, our urban middle class has clearly indicated a preference for authoritarianism, whether it is a direct military authoritarianism like the Musharraf kind or the Ayub Khan kind, which are still remembered as the golden years of Pakistan, etc., where the urban middle class has really got it good. And now under Imran, they think that at least our ideological preferences for strong authoritarian leader will be met. So I think we are at a very important critical point, which is why I go back to saying, and to echoing what Salman has said, the middle class needs to recognize that the only way this country can stick together is via the constitution. And by all means, make amendments, but don't make the sort of amendments that either would give you an Amirul Momineen. And we came very close to that at one time in 1993, with one Baloch vote stopped Nawaz Sharif from becoming an Amirul Momineen, standing above parliament. And of course, he's learned his lesson now. And Asif Zardari went a step further when he devolved power to the constituent units, which is of course now creating problems for the military establishment, because the money is no longer there with the federal government; it's gone to the provinces. And so I think we're facing issues such as this, and therefore an election next year, by the time this crisis is subsidized and we pulled out of the economic crisis and the diplomatic isolation in which the last government has thrust us, will be a time to test the popular will and to see which way we want to go. But as I said earlier, any attempt to derail this system right now will end up in more anarchy and chaos.
Great, thank you for that, Najma. And of course, as usual, I've noted down 12 topics that we need to discuss further, but maybe several other talks. But let me bring in, because we only have a few minutes left now, but let me bring in Salman, because there are a couple of very interesting questions directed towards him. The first is about the anti-defection law. Now, of course, Pakistan has a very robust anti-defection law, and if you compare this to other countries, it's very strict in some manners. What do you think is, can be done more, or do you really think that the current anti-defection law is strong enough? Because that's one tool that's been used by Imran Khan to say, well, that's all strong enough, and they should be disqualified for all its life. And I just here want to read one comment which has been very cleverly made by someone, and it says that don't you think that the absence of the PTI candidate in the Punjab created a valid reason for its members to vote for Hamza, as Pervez Elahi wasn't really present. So this is one very interesting interpretation that someone has given in the chat box. The second thing that I really want to ask you, Salman, again in a larger context, is the question about the legitimacy of the judiciary, and especially the Supreme Court. And of course, this relates to the current conversations in the last couple of days in the US with the Roe versus Wade a decision about to be overturned. A lot of people are questioning the legitimacy of the US Supreme Court, where it has this great stature that a lot of the judges in the Supreme Court of Pakistan want to kind of emulate. So what do you think is happening to the question of the legitimacy of the Supreme Court in Pakistan through the judgment that restored the resolution of no confidence, and subsequently how the Supreme Court is actually reacting on a number of other petitions?
Let me start with the second question. As I said in my opening comments, that the judgment that restored the assembly is not really a judgment that required any great jurisprudential breakthroughs or innovation. It was a very simple, straightforward judgment that the speaker could not have prevented the vote of no confidence, and the prime minister therefore could not have dissolved the assembly. So there's nothing really revolutionary about that judgment. But the fact that it's evoked this kind of a response among so many of our urban middle class compatriots is what is interesting. So the idea that the Supreme Court should somehow have delivered a popular judgment rather than a correct judgment goes back to, the conversation about the nature of the involvement or the engagement of the urban middle classes with the constitutional order, and the extent to which they actually understand what's going on in the Supreme Court. So for them, somehow the Supreme Court is a chamber that should give good judgments, that should give judgments that please them, and not judgments that in some sense are true to the intent of the Constitution. So that's a very big disconnect. So to expect the Supreme Court to be an arbiter of what they think is the moral way forward, rather than to act as a technical chamber that decides things technically according to the law and the Constitution, is the disconnect that I think needs to be overcome in our society. And we're seeing that in the US also, by the way, now. So what is happening in the US is that the political divide around the Roe v. Wade judgment that's lasted all these years since 1972 when the judgment was delivered is not really, at the end of the day, a technically informed divide. Even in a literate, educated society such as the US, it has become a political issue. It is a politically divided discourse. Now, what the US Supreme Court is doing at one level, is doing what people expect possible or expect as something that is possible within the realm of constitutional interpretation and the leeway that constitutional interpretation provides to you. In many respects, the original Roe v. Wade judgment was, something that stretched the text of the Constitution. One can easily argue that. Now, to consider the original Roe v. Wade judgment as, somehow reflecting absolutely the true essence of the US Constitution, and any deviation from that as some kind of, coming down, as if it were, from jurisprudential heights is in itself an interesting question for me. Because the jurisprudential debate on this, on Roe v. Wade, all these decades, has been far more nuanced, and academic commentators have accepted that the matter could have gone either way. And the decision in 1972 was a decision that resided on the edges, as if it were, of the jurisprudence that was relevant. So that's a conversation that will go on. And given the nature of the US Supreme Court, where Republicans and Democrats get to appoint their own judges, so at some point in the future, you could see a different judgment going back to Roe v. Wade. But what we need to understand in Pakistan, therefore, is that constitutional interpretation is not really, the exercise of an algorithm. There is a great deal of interpretive leeway that judges have, and to give meaning to words is a creative enterprise. And what judges do is they should give effect to the intent of the Constitution. But what is the intent of the Constitution is not always clear. So we have 3 or 4 different approaches to reading the Constitution. I mean, if I go with the US conversation, you've got the Dworkinian take on how the Constitution should be read, in which you do a moral reading of the Constitution. You've got the Scalia way of looking at the Constitution, where you try and unearth the original intent of the framers of the Constitution through some kind of, creative archaeological work. Or you've got, the way Lawrence Tribe looks at the Constitution, perhaps the most influential modern day scholar of the Constitution. For him, it's a question of structure, of different parts of the Constitution gelling together, and each part being given a meaning that allows it to harmonize with other parts of the Constitution. So there are these technical debates, jurisprudential debates that go on, that are going on. Now in Pakistan, what happens is that the whole thing, rather than being seen as a philosophic, interpretive conversation, is seen as a partisan outcome. So different judges are, sought to be related to different personalities. Their political, past or their political aspirations are immediately brought into play. And the whole thing comes down to a level of accusation rather than understanding how the technical outcome could have been one way or it could have been the other way, and why both outcomes fall within the realm of what is jurisprudentially possible. Now, that's a sophisticated conversation that we do not have at the popular level. So at the popular level, the memes that we are seeing, the social media attack on the Supreme Court that we are seeing has really brought it down to the level of personalizing the various judges of the Supreme Court. And to me, that's a very sad situation. It really shows that even among fairly educated people, doctors and accountants that one meets with all the time, the understanding of the Constitution and how the judiciary engages with the Constitution is less than rudimentary. So what we are seeing is a society that at some level is literate, but in understanding the democratic processes and in understanding the Constitution and the engagement of the Supreme Court with the Constitution is entirely illiterate. So we've had this, flux of cynicism against the Supreme Court, which is not good. Any Supreme Court, any judiciary at the end of the day has to have a certain degree of trust in its functioning among the people whose disputes it's resolving. So for a judiciary to be so easily maligned and maligned by people who should know better, maligned by people who are literate, educated, urban, is a crisis that we need to think about. So for me, more than the political crisis, this is the crisis that I worry about. What is the nature of our educated classes with the political process, with the constitutional process, and with the judiciary? Now, unless we get these conversations going and achieve some level of education in society, then the students that Dr. Baqai talked about, her 150, are probably as constitutionally illiterate as the doctors and the accountants and the bankers I dine with and socialize with. So we've got across society a kind of almost a fascistic attitude towards constitutional processes, whereby we do not like any outcome which is not in some sense politically acceptable to us.
Great. Thank you very, very much for that, Salman. And just a quick comment. I know we are out of time, but just wanted your quick comment on the anti-defection law. Do you think that's strong enough?
I think we have a fairly good anti-defection clause now. Article 63A of the Constitution restricts the freedom of conscience of members of parliament with respect to only 3 matters. And that, I think, is a fair balance, rather than going the whole hog and saying no member can vote on anything against party directives, which is the case in India, by the way. I think that is excessive, that is draconian. What we have is that on the budget, a money bill, constitutional amendment, and a vote of confidence or no confidence against the Prime Minister or the Chief Minister, you have to obey the directions of the parliamentary party. And that, I think, is a middle ground we've achieved over time. If you look at the amendment that came in 1974, an Article 96 was added to the Constitution that went way beyond what we today have as Article 63A. So I'm quite okay with the way Article 63 is today, subject to how the Supreme Court interprets it. If they, take it to mean that the vote of the dissenting member will not count, or the dissenting member will become disqualified for life, not being a mean in terms of Article 62(1)(f), then I think we will need to have another conversation.
Great. Thank you so much. And I really want to take this opportunity to thank the whole panel. I think one thing that two very important takeaways is the fact that, this conversation will continue because, yes, we have had a crisis, but I think Najma is very correct that the next few months are as critical for us. And I think, the consequences we need to be aware of. We also need to be very much aware of where the middle class is actually leading, and this whole middle class narrative and reactions and all of that as compared to as Najma actually said, real Pakistan, there is another Pakistan there also. How does that react? And I think Salman, you've been very critically. You have pointed out that the lack of constitutional literacy in Pakistan is a huge gap. Which exists throughout the spectrum of Pakistan, from the upper class to the lower class and everywhere in between. And this is a conversation that we really must have. And I think Dr. Baqai was very important in linking this whole Imran kind of euphoria with the youth and the aspirations that are kind of in Pakistan and in the Pakistani youth, which is 60% of the population, and that is now getting its frustrations out through the Imran narrative. So I think these are all very important conversations, and I thank you all for taking time to participate in this. I thank the whole audience from across the world for participating in this. And I thank the Mittal Institute and especially Salman, who's at the background, like managing all of that, for actually putting this together, and also Hitesh for agreeing for this panel. I think this is an important conversation on Pakistan, which we will continue to have here at the Mittal Institute, so that the progress and the development of Pakistan is spoken about and discussed further. So thank you again.